let's start with this discussion of just global adoption. It was addressed in Miami with Michael Saylor and some of the top tier players in the space who are bringing, like, Mike Novogratz, who are bringing in institutional investors. Do you guys feel that, do you see the adoption, and what do you think about it? Maybe start with Christian or Eric.
Well, adapt this. Let me complete the question because I get this presented quite a bit. I think I've heard the term cryptocurrency adoption, blockchain adoption, maybe a million times over the last 10 years, maybe more often. So the gut response I always give is adoption by who and for what, right? And so as a technology investor, we look at this from the perspective. So who's your client and what problem are you solving? So in the context of your specific example of El Salvador, and obviously I applaud that, right? I think it's a great move, and hopefully Nigeria or other countries will follow suit real quick. What most people don't know actually is that Switzerland or some canton in Switzerland allowed you to pay their fees and fines and other things already in Bitcoin in 2017. But again, it's just a niche application for something. The larger point here, though, is to be able to discern what are they adapting it for. So in El Salvador specifically, they have already been using this as a payment system. So using Bitcoin and Bitcoin Lightning specifically as a payment network of sorts. But at the end of the day, payments is really not an interesting use case. What I mean by that specifically is even the reason why they adopted this quite obviously is because their own currency failed in terms of hyperinflation. So that means it lost kind of its pricing function, which is the main function of money today. It's your language of value, it's your pricing function. You need to be able to understand what you're looking at. And that's why when you look at your digital wallet, you obviously see the translation of your Bitcoin in US dollars if you're in the United States. And so overall, though, the bigger picture that everybody needs to kind of hone in on is the fact that the Federal Reserve kind of already abandoned even tracking things like M1 and M2. And there specifically, I think, and that's a theory with a strong opinion, very weakly held, is M1 at stasis. So your checking account should really not exist, because any fiat currency quite obviously is not ever going to reduce in the number issued. It's always going to increase, meaning it's always going to lose purchasing power. So, and you're already mitigating against this manually. Everybody does, right? You hopefully don't keep all of your wealth in the fiat currency of sorts. And the technology that's being built, really, if you think about this from a plumbing perspective, anything that's DeFi is really at the core fighting against that particular state. So from a technologist perspective, M1, money at stasis, currency at stasis, should not even exist. So you can move money from M2 to M2, and that's the prediction from my end, and that's the foregone conclusion that we came to 5 years ago when we started looking at the space. Is like in 5-10 years from now, M1 at stasis, there's no reason for it to exist, just like you don't have a copper phone line. It doesn't have to exist from a technology perspective. You move from M2 M1 M2. So if you look at the research around topics of CBDC, central bank digital currencies, there were actually two teams that were smart enough to come to the same conclusion, albeit they simply halted their research and development at this point in time, because that will immediately put most commercial banks out of business, because they derived 30% of their money from charging fees in the context of payments. But the primary and lasting use case for fiat is simply that of lending. And like my colleague earlier said, so the early investment opportunities are in this space. We are one of the lead investors in Provenance, so that they wrote the largest securitized lending solution, largest HELOC since the financial crisis last year, for more than $300 million. So the primary use case there is lending, but an important thing to realize there is that cryptocurrencies, blockchain-based solutions cannot address that, because we diverted the power of creating money, creating fiat currencies, to commercial banks. Because when they create a loan, a securitized loan, this is new money. So this is actually the main source of inflation and the main inflation incurring to the asset class. Anyway, I'm gonna again, Mariana, always feel free to stop me because I typically talk about these topics really nonstop for at least an hour, right?
I think I totally get the point. In terms of this whole, time that we're approaching of full liquidity, right? And in that full liquidity of a system, having multiple currencies is kind of meaningless because you can access anything at
Yeah.
any time, right?
So yeah, well, when so what you're referring to is essentially velocity when you say liquidity. So velocity is one of our criteria when we look at the solution. So that's why I usually then look at the typical scenario that everybody will be familiar with, but always talks in vacuous terms about, such as stable coins, right? So what is the use case for stable coins? Look at the individual use cases, right? And I was just reading yet another useless article about El Salvador should have adopted a stablecoin and stuff like that. Is that at the end of the day, that's all nonsense, right? So the larger point to understand here, though, is if you look at the individual implementation, the use case of Tether, for example, what's the use case of Tether? You can simply measure that, and you will see the use cases to stay mostly on centralized custodial exchanges and speculate on Bitcoin back and forth, right? That's the main use case of Tether, and within that use case, it has a velocity that's one order of magnitude greater than the US dollar. And the reason why that is because there's a penalty attached to move into fiat from a cryptocurrency specifically. So that's its use case, that's its velocity. So as far as other currencies are concerned, again, when you're introducing a new unit of account, what you're really doing, you're doing the most stupid thing you could possibly do when introducing your technology, because you introduce a new language of your technology. That's a non-starter as far as the adoption of technology, specific of network technology, because at the end of the day, all money technologies are network technologies. And the largest network effect, and that's the important part to realize, will not change. The largest network effect is that of the US dollar as a unit of account, and don't fight that, right? So you need to abstract that layer of complexity away that makes people think they have to buy Tether or have to buy some other stable coin. That cannot be visible for the adoption or finally get to that particular point in order for adoption to occur, because adoption of users occurs not of technology. They adopt solutions. Users did not adopt voice over IP. They adopted Skype and WhatsApp, right? And so we are still far away removed from that. And that's not because of the lack of yet another unit of account, yet another cryptocurrency. It's because we are lacking the cryptographic primitives that make up the counterpart. By counterpart, I mean these are all key lock systems. They're only valuable and assignable to you if, when, where you actually have the capacity to assign agency and attribution. That's why the biggest problem that we're solving for right now within this space that very few people talk about, realize that this is important and invalidate most of what they're working on right now, is the topic of KYC, know your customer, which is utter nonsense and should be unconstitutional. So the way this is going to be solved is you attach PII only if, when, where there's actually a legally required reason to that. And I'm working with local law enforcement at the cybercrime division here specifically on one tiny bit of that, which is biometric identification using body cameras from police, to make sure that you can actually inject the legally required prerequisite if you identify a person using biometric data. Because this is all like being rolled out right now. That's what I think is also being ignored largely. You need to be focused on the solutions that are being adopted right now, which is biometric identification, which is good health pass and other things like that, that will carry through the entire ecosystem. Because if you have a digital identity that's tethered to these particular fiat identifiers, that's what they're called technically, at that point in time, all your account-based systems are invalidated, and we need to invalidate those. We need to invalidate all database solutions. It's the digital landfill at the end of the day that we need to curtail and roll back. That's the core problem here.
Very fascinating. I mean, it's just once you start thinking this way, you change the whole coordinate system. Ali, you had a
Well,
question? Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted to chime in. Seemed like the issue was relevant and something I regularly
Go
discuss on.
ahead.
Like I said, it was if I can contribute or if there's
Yeah,
any
go ahead.
questions.
Oh, okay. Great. Good to have you, as always. Tell us a little bit about your background, Ali.
Sure, thanks. My name's Allie. I'm an attorney based in New York. Started in investment banking, then went off to law school, worked as a securities attorney for some time, went in house for a couple of fintech firms, and now I run my own firm where I advise blockchain developers, creators, NFT, pretty much everything in the tech space.
Awesome. We'll have a lot of questions for you as well. Sam, you had a question? Samuel?
I think when you get up on the stage, your mic is already automatically on, and I was just turned it off so I can listen. I was looking at Allie's resume. She's had all this she said, and then I look further down, and she goes psilocybin and all this. I was like, wow, she's into everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's go down this discussion of, we're in the middle of discussing um, few of the things that happened in Miami. Michael Saylor, I watched his interview, and Mike Novogratz kind of gave me hope that institutional adoption of, an investment in cryptocurrencies is happening. It seems that Michael Saylor today is also committing to another 1.6 billion in purchasing of more Bitcoin for his treasury. He also volunteered that his career as the CEO of a technology company that lasted about 30 years, which is probably the longest lasting CEO in the space, was kind of at a tail end, and he was going to retire, and kind of discovered Bitcoin a year ago, revived his whole career, his point of view, revived his whole company. People feel this corporate culture that's very interesting to them, and they want to belong, to his company today. And I feel like there was a real shift in his life that happened due to this discovery of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Just wonder if anybody wants to comment on, do you think this is going to be a trend going forward, and would this be something that other companies in the space experience?
well, this company is basically a Bitcoin ETF right now, right? And so I mean, uh, that's kind of the way it occurred because the SEC is slow to approve one, which is utter nonsense, right? That should have been approved a long time ago. So it's people buying that stock that want to hold Bitcoin essentially. Smart move on his part for sure, but at the end of the day, he's just talking his book, right? Which you can't fault him for that, obviously, and makes for a great treasury asset. So yeah, and at the end of the day, it's going to diversify the holders more, which is great, and brings more publicity to it, which is also great. So that will kind of mitigate against nonsense like Elon Musk reversing his opinion on that thing, which I think everybody on this call probably already knows that this whole Bitcoin energy thing has always been a red herring. So it's not even worth talking about. That has been debunked for a long time. But yeah, I mean, overall, you have to like the sentiment, all buy it. I'm not sure that there's a lot of technical understanding behind it. Bitcoin is a symbol at the end of the day. It's kind of a symbol of freedom and free speech. And if and when where this has some utility, it's awesome. And then hopefully from there it leads to actual technical innovation that will lend itself further to human freedom.
Would you mind rephrasing the question? I'm sorry, my phone was cutting out a little, Mariana.
I was just asking if you believe that the institutional adoption and also the enterprise corporate treasury adoption of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies will continue.
I mean, my personal opinion, yes, for sure. I think that's definitely where it's heading, and you're starting to see El Salvador and on a international level, I think it's going to prompt institutions to take a hold and incorporate blockchain and cryptocurrencies far more. With regard to Christian's point of ETFs, I mean, I definitely think that's on the securities agenda, one of the probably main points to try to finally start allowing through. I think they have like 10 applications being held up right now. So I think once they start cracking down on marketplaces and allow ETFs, and we start seeing some more regulatory oversight, I think institutions are going to feel more and more comfortable being able to come in and start engaging.
Yeah, I mean, as a former attorney, I have very strong thoughts on what the SEC is doing and also what FinCEN has been doing. I wrote a review of their guidance paper in 2013, which is utterly absurd if you just read this on face value, because they're talking about virtual currencies and they're phrasing it in a way that basically you could also then call Pokemons a virtual currency under their particular quote unquote definition. But more importantly, if you require people to have a money transmitter license and a money service business license in order to buy and sell Bitcoin in a particular way, at that point in time, you're really saying two things: either that the US dollar is not money or Bitcoin is money, because they both have very, very different criteria if you just put them next to each other, with Bitcoin having a stable supply and things are being fully collateralized. You have a digital bearer instrument. All of these things are not true for fiat currencies, quite obviously, and probably won't be coming true anytime soon, but even though they might come true by accident. So the point there being is, I think what should be done is we should mount, from a legal perspective at least, challenges against all these particular guidances, because they're on face value absurd, and so are like
Not
legacy
not sure.
regulations. So you know that there's like Charlie Schramm is one
But
prominent
Christian,
example.
I just want to
Yeah,
make note. So the FinCEN that you're speaking of, I'm assuming you're referring to the payment processing
that
and
was
their
the
definition. They're
2013.
over.
Yeah, the 2013 guidance paper. Yeah. I mean, when you search for it, you probably first find my review on that. But anyhow, yeah. What's your question?
I just don't think there is much guidance right now that's been set out by any of the agencies. I think they're all kind of waiting upon each other for a collaborative effort. And I think there's initiative in the US, like the Eliminate Barriers to Innovation Act, where you're starting to see the CFTC and the SEC collaborate and try to come to some sort of agreement. Obviously, cryptocurrencies are quite broad, so it's not
Yeah.
it's not. I don't think anybody's taking an approach to try to do a wide spread definition or.
Yeah, I'll share the link. Now, this goes all the way back to FinCEN's enforcement actions in 2013. So, I mean, a lot of the original history books on Bitcoin mention that, but the larger point is a different one altogether. It really comes down to none of these folks understanding technology in principle, because at the end of the day, this is all smart contract based systems. These are all smart contract based systems, right? So you have to look at every single quote unquote token or every single coin. These are two different things, on their own merits, right? So this overarching description of cryptocurrency is utterly not useful at all. And obviously, the industry hasn't done itself a lot of favors of reverting towards a nomenclature such as tokens and coins, because there's no such thing. Obviously, these are just metaphors to describe certain standardized smart contracts in the context
That's what
of
I disagree
tokens,
with
right?
you over. I
There's
don't
no
think
disagreement.
they are doing a broad. I don't think they're doing a broad definition. The FinCEN obviously has no real regulatory oversight, right? They mostly have recommendation. But I feel as all the
No, no,
main
no.
agencies that will be defining and regulating and creating a path forward for cryptocurrencies, they have been very hands off as far as not trying to do any sort of sweeping definitions
Well, and I hope
or
they continue
single
that.
handed approach.
I don't want regulatory and agencies to get involved in cryptocurrency and try to
Well,
control the
too
game
bad
for
it's,
everybody.
yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah,
happening,
so
right?
Yeah.
mass
So
adoption is happening.
there's three levels of conflation here. So obviously none of the regulatory agencies have any say about technologies at all, right? So regulatory agencies address the behavior of people within their jurisdiction. So that's the overarching fallacy here to begin with, because all of these are global technologies. So it's important in step one to understand the technologies. The second part to understand is that these are open source technologies that are in constant development. They're changing in their nature on principle. The last thing that's important, there's people in prison right now. That's important to understand, or people that waste their time trying to file nonsense licenses like the bit license, right? These are real world people that are either sitting in prisons or wasting their time for no particular reason other than either regulatory agencies not understanding technologies and or being lobbied really hard by legacy financial service providers to engage with these technologies implementers, right? So again, it's simple, basic technology misunderstandings. And then more importantly, and we've seen this hundreds of times in projects that we want to invest in, is really bad legal advice that these teams have been getting, like implement KYCs and so forth. That was the worst thing that I've ever seen large
Why is that bad
legal firms
advice?
doing, right?
Why
Pardon
would
me?
it be ill-advised to
Yeah.
recommend KYC and AML measurements? And I just want
Here's
to also make
a
note,
very
if I
common
may.
sense example. So a lot of the things that happened in 2017, 2018, right, involved the idea that you could sell a utility token. And let's set aside whether or not that's a thing and whether or not these things were scams, right? The larger point here, though, is if then I am with a law firm that's recommending that these people should do KYC, why would you want to do that when you're saying you're selling a utility token? You just reversed the burden of proof. You just gave the guy on the other end all the ammunition he ever needed, right? I was working for the state attorney's office after law school, right? This is the easiest thing. It's like, if you told a blanket, why did you have to see the password of that person? This is just other nonsense to require, right? So you need to make
I'm
your
sorry.
decision how
I
to.
respectfully disagree. I think I see your profile and I think you're involved, maybe on the technical side, and there's some overlap on the regulatory, but I am very immersed on the
No,
regulatory and
no,
the
no, no.
legal side. And I just,
No,
I think
no,
some of your, let
no.
me
I
just finish,
wrote some
Christian,
of the
if I may.
regulation
Let
of
me
the
just finish, if
European.
I may.
No,
I really,
no, no.
I
Again,
just think your personal opinion, on
no. It's not an
interpretation,
opinion.
right? Saying that
It's not an
but it
interpretation.
is an opinion, right? It's
No,
not
no. It's an
factual.
observation. It's no, no, no. It's simply based on
Okay, well,
observation.
it's your based on your personal observation, which could be interpreted as an opinion of its own because it's subjective.
Again, so yeah.
But
I
all
mean, we
I'm
can
merely
put.
saying is some of the comments that you're making, right, as far as being ill-advised, I think they're being addressed. I think before any regulatory movements are being done, they're getting experts from the outside agencies. You have Gensler, who is far more well
Oh,
versed and knowledgeable on
yeah.
blockchain than your average Joe. And again, you might have your own personal reservations, but let's really present a full picture of how this is being
Yeah.
handled.
So so the main fallacy here is to expect that regulation will influence the development of technology. The typical example that I make for this always is when we invented the automobile. Regulators first implemented a law that required a person with a red flag to walk in front of this automobile. Obviously that's nonsense. Obviously, we eventually did away with that
Not even
regulation. But
analogous.
we are doing the
I
same
think you're
today. Yeah, we're doing the same today with things like KYC, right? So if you take the technology constraints away, KYC quite bluntly is unconstitutional, right? Because if you look at the last 1,000 transactions that
I'm sorry.
involved your
All
demand
right, I'm
deposit
going to head
account,
out.
right?
I don't think you're actually very well informed as far as the regulatory component of it. I think if you're going to propose something on an area that you're not immersed in, I think it should definitely be with an asterisk of it being your
No,
own
no.
personal opinion, because
I wrote some of the deregulation papers for European telecommunication
I
markets
don't
20 years
I
ago.
don't
So
know if
we
you're 20 years ago, right? 20
so we
years
are
ago, and
current.
how much
So we
has
are
it evolved since then, and
yeah.
how
So no,
much are they
All
we are
right, so
current.
let
utilizing?
me chime in. I think
Yeah.
what we're just, I think we're kind of arguing over things that are like apples and oranges. I think what Christian's trying to say is that if you assume that the tokens are utility tokens, i.e. have a true utility in the actual network, they're really not a currency and they should not have to comply with those laws. That's all he's saying. He's not saying, abandon KYC in every direction, in every aspect of our financial systems, etc. So I think that's kind of what's the point that's being missed. And I agree with him on the utility because as we build these companies, we have to connect the actual value of the business with the value of that token. And we saw like several companies today at the Salon that did that really well, like Gala Games being one of them. They assigned a utility value to their, Gala tokens, and because of that, they were able to go from 0 to 330,000 users in just 6 months. So we're really focused on like what's going to grow the system, how are we going to build it with strategy and in a way that it's going to grow. The uptake is going to be fastest, the adoption is going to be fastest. So let me jump out of the currency discussion for a moment and maybe go into some other things that are happening in the space. The week
Actually, Mariana,
before.
since
Mhm.
I've been quiet, perhaps I can put in my 2 pennies on the subject.
Go ahead, Eric.
Um, I think to some extent, with regards to the discussion between Christian and Ali, we're getting lost in the forest. We're sort of discussing a great deal about small details, but we need to have a bigger picture. And I think that Christian is exactly right in his perspectives because they are bigger perspectives. They're opinions perhaps that are informed by a great deal of perspective at the regulatory level and at the business level. I think that one of the things that is rarely discussed is that there is law in the United States, but it's largely irrelevant because it's written. It's the jurisprudence in this country is generally tilted towards a great deal of leeway at the administrative level, and the fact that we haven't actually drawn the line. So the way that Germany did it, for example, is they looked at Bitcoin and they said, well, it looks like a currency. So it's just another currency. So we're good with it, right? It's legal. Okay, done. End of story, right? Here, 10 years later, we're still deliberating about in which way it's legal and all this kind of stuff. And it's not because it's a difficult question. It's not because we have a greater level of sophistication in our rhetoric or in our argumentation. It's really just because we don't want to draw the line. Because so long as we don't draw the line, then we have a great deal of leeway in administering stuff. So what really ultimately happens, and I'm speaking from my own experience being in the business of selling Bitcoin for physical cash, which which is a particularly difficult business where there is law, but there's also policy. There's private policy, the policy of the banks, and all this other kind of stuff. And what we have observed is that there is like Christian said, the lawyers, because we have batteries and batteries of them, they will give you all kinds of advice, and it's just it's locked in. It's the advice. What you can expect a lawyer to say is going to originate from this sort of small box where they basically don't know, and the government doesn't want anyone to know. They rule by fear. Companies and technology development and innovation is curtailed in this nation because there is uncertainty, but that uncertainty is intentional. We that's that So there's an old, and actually Christian might resonate with this. There's an old sort of joke that says, if you ask the Germanic countries whether you can or can't do something, they'll sort of deliberate and they'll come back and they'll say yes or no. And that's great because you can just move on. If you ask in the Latin countries, you really needn't bother because they're so confused they can't even give you an answer and they can't enforce it anyway. But if you ask in the Anglo-Saxon countries, the answer is, well, we're not really going to tell you. What we're going to do is we're going to let you run until you get big enough, and then we're going to come back and we're going to say we want a cut, we want a piece of this, right? And this is I think how things are run. So perhaps the discussion between Ali and Christian can be sort of framed from that perspective, that yes, there is law and there's a great deal of detail to law, but then there is the actual world where governments violate the law all the time. Government agencies and they rule by fear. So that's my 2 pence on the subject.
Yeah, you're
Mariana,
right.
I was wondering if I could.
So that's so those are go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about some of the other things that were in the newsletter. I was particularly interested in the Althea AI NFT, and also how that relates to the Gala Games thing that came up in our earlier Infiom Salon. And I'm just wondering if there's a thought that blockchain may become a way to reward crowdsourcing of different pieces of creative properties.
I think that's a brilliant. Oops, sorry. That's a brilliant connection. There's an Amber Alert here in addition to power outages today, so apologies, everyone. It's a brilliant connection, Jeanette, that you just made between what Althea AI presented last year with basically generating uh, keynote speakers and a variety of actors in the video space by AI alone, by putting different components of this person's look, feel, etc., into AI, and then creating this person for the purpose of video creation. And then the fact that they're now minting NFTs using this sort of generation through AI of the video experiences, which is, I think, more novel than what we're seeing with some of the art NFTing in our space that's going on
But
over the last couple of months.
yeah, it seems to me that it relates to some of the things that Gala Games is doing in terms of players developing or earning assets. But I think we're going to see I think we're going to see moving forward that it's less about gameplay and more about adding the creative components. And so much about AI is training and enriching the ML part of this. And I'm wondering if companies are going to start using blockchain as a way to reward people that are doing that work.
Yeah, there are quite a few companies. I would say I've been working on this OTT company for about a year out of Europe, and we had a variety of discussions with a variety of native chains over the last few months, and each one of them, whether it's Tezos or Neo or something being built on Polygon, etc., each one of these native chains has a project that's trying to do just that. Kind of go to the producers of film and television, producers of games, and try to actually create a format where they can get rewarded for what they build within experiences. So I'm definitely seeing that as a trend, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, but also I think for the specific, I mean, so much of training any kind of artificial intelligence is sort of is teaching the machine learning component and training it and mapping those decisions. And I'm just wondering too if that part in any given AI universe, whether it's developing a talking head or developing a very efficient way to uh, put door handles on cars, I mean, it seems like that process. In the Gala Games discussion, he was talking about how somebody in a developing country could use this technology to help buy the land that they live on. But I'm also wondering if that same person could get a financial opportunity that actually builds out new universes and builds out intelligence in these spaces.
Absolutely, 100%. It's happening in many different companies already. That people are, they may not be using AI. They may be building things inside games. There was a whole article that we sent, I think, a couple of newsletters ago, where in Philippines people are playing inside a specific game, getting small things inside the game built out, and based on that, they were able to quit their day jobs and live off of that game per se. So we see this in Superworld as being something they're aspiring to. A company called Cent, CENT, that is kind of creating perception of someone's ability to become famous as part of their ecosystem. They were allowing some people in third world countries to sustain themselves through working inside their game-like environment. Yes, I believe that that's a component because they're building consensus economy. So when you have a consensus economy, it is all about how to create reward for that, for that work that was produced inside the consensus economy for the, component of it to move forward. So far, I've seen a lot of really strong consensus economies for the technology side. What Christian and Eric were talking about, where people are actually building the technology aspect of the business, where they maintain a node. It's a CPU, GPU, storage node, et cetera, et cetera. But now I feel that companies like Games and Superworlds of the world, Sense, et cetera, they're all going to reward creators like people in Hollywood contributing to this economy in different ways, and will be paying them for this with a utility token, of course. So a
And
lot to be done in that space, yes.
yeah, and I wonder too, bringing in the Square article about the solar farms and the sustainable farming techniques. I think my gut is telling me that the pandemic was a reset button for a lot of us, and that we are starting to turn a little more attention to developing businesses that we feel good about and that really make the world a better place. And I was wondering if you had a sense of that from what you're seeing out of Miami.
The discussion in Miami was largely structured around this because with Elon's, tweets and his action of pulling, Tesla out of the, inability now to purchase Tesla with Bitcoin, which was a, big event on Twitter and in PR in general. And, a lot of people attribute the market tumbling to him. Could be true, who knows? But it certainly isn't helping. There was a huge emphasis on the fact, what Christian was saying earlier, that this is like a red herring discussion about the energy consumption in the proof of work environments, like, Bitcoin, for example. It really isn't any more energy being used in traditional networks, being maintained, and all the energy that is being used in a variety of industries, beyond tech. So when these comparisons are thrown out, they are usually not, supported by any sort of evidence, and additionally, they're not true. And most
So,
importantly, they're kind of in vacuum of everything else.
so Christian, do you think this is a marketing problem?
What is a marketing problem?
The green energy consumption by blockchain.
It's one of these strawman arguments, I think, right? Because actually, and I don't really have to mention this, I think, to anybody here, but other people should know, because decentralized software solutions, including things like graph and blockchains, are obviously an ideal tool to find the perfect equilibrium and make the best use of our energy sources at large, right? And needless to say, like if miners are getting penalized for using proof of work systems within a different jurisdictions, they're just going to move on. It's just like the typical conflation and misunderstanding of what these technologies do and scales and scale and how they are working, right? And for me, this is all really really annoying to see, because we need to have the bigger discussions, right? We need to address the things that we should be addressing right now, that all of us face, right, as humans. And that is anthropomorphic global climate change. But the way to do this is not create these kind of strawman arguments and try to pick on one particular technology with an agenda. And that's clearly what this is. It's an agenda. The way this is,
But
uh,
do you
yeah.
think that as this affects consumer, I mean, it seems like consumers are going to graduate to the piece of all of this that they can understand, right? And so that's what I mean by a marketing problem. If consumers are afraid of or are turned away from this tech because of this story, then we need
Yeah,
to rewrite the story, right?
well,
It's just
yeah, that's
inconsequential.
yeah, that's overall true. I mean, I guess more importantly is, like, most people don't actually want to learn about the technology. Period. Full stop. Right? You don't. Your mom doesn't care how her iPhone works. So you just want to implement the technology to make people's lives better. And that's the real adoption. Right. So in the meantime, there might be some stories around that, and we are still, as you guys know, very, very early, right? Less than 2% of the world that has internet access actually has engaged with that technology, and that's if you count people who bought cryptocurrencies on centralized exchanges. So this is kind of a really unuseful attempt to kind of squash the this particular type of system in its tracks, which won't be successful. It's just a sideshow, and as I said, it's not all that much worth talking about, other than providing the facts. And actually, I see that a lot of good outfits are now doing this. They're just listing the facts. And but the thing is, this has been debunked 14 times since Sunday. We wrote an article about this, I think, 4 years ago, because it all goes back. It's kind of like the vaccine story that people keep percolating, which is all based on some misguided study in Britain from decades ago that was flawed to begin with. And this was also the same case here. So if you just keep hammering on that narrative with real facts, at the end of the day, you can ignore gravity, but you will fall always flat on your face. And more importantly, you can't uninvent these technologies. They're deeply embedded already in how commercial activity is evolving today. But it has to evolve in the way that your mom doesn't have to learn a new language when she adopts a quote unquote digital wallet or something else, right? So your next browser that you implement should be a browser that is independent from commercial interest and actually will not even show you this type of nonsense. That comes back to my favorite pet peeve, is that we don't even have a search engine today, right? We have an advertising company that kind of pretends to be a search engine. And that's a larger problem, really, that we allow this type of misinformation to percolate, and that it even gets any airtime at all. And that's a problem with media, but that's also a problem with the structure of the internet, right? So my take to that is always, reality doesn't have an advertising budget, so I need to speak for it.
Very funny. It's true. I'm shocked at the media coverage of the space. A few years ago, we had someone interning at, Bid Angels for us, who basically was tracking at Annenberg School of Communications here at USC, how media was talking about Bitcoin, blockchain, and other, players in the space. And it was 95% probably negative. And here we are in 2021, maybe 3 or 4 years later, it's still the same case. It just continues on, as they say.
Yeah, we should
Brian,
just mark it for what it is. It's just silly, like silly. Period. It's not worth talking about. Right? Ignore it.
yeah,
Like, don't give
I.
it airtime. Don't make it a discussion. Right? It's like, if you want to believe the world is flat, believe the world is flat. Right?
So, Brian, you had a question. One more. We have 3 minutes left here in our
Yeah,
discussion.
sure. So I'm trying to figure out. I'm brand new to what you call it, Clubhouse. So it's like, how do I mute? How do I unmute? I have no idea. So yeah, I agree. It's marketing. I would love to see a better image of our current technology, our current implementations, applications using the technology. It would be great. Christian, one of the things that really struck me as interesting in your earlier comments, you talked about identity as being a problem. I'd love to hear more about that. I'd love to understand or start to learn what policy is happening out there
Yeah,
what
yeah.
groups are maybe
Okay, well,
establishing
Christian,
policy?
Brian, that's the wrong question. He can talk an hour about it. But two
Yeah,
minutes,
I
Christian. Can you do it in
apologize.
2 minutes?
Yes.
Tell me the groups. Tell me the groups. What are the standards groups out there that might actually be trying to do this? I would love to research more about this topic.
Yeah, so actually we have a GitHub library that addresses the basic taxonomy because identity is not even the right term. That's a different discipline altogether. It's the whole space of transhumanism that's working on that.
Identification and enumeration of all
Uh,
objects of the known universe.
Yeah, so it's actually a 33 level deep layer of identifiers, verification, certification, identification, and so forth that we are clarifying because these are legal technologies. So you have to understand the legal concepts that are behind that. And more importantly, there are already standards that people are using, that Homeland Security is using, that an organization that I'm deeply involved with that set the data exchange standard for the travel space is using. So it's integrating with that to then facilitate economic activity in the real world. And so obviously that we're still using silly things like plastic cards for identification and so forth. It's just sad at this point in time of technology, right? And so now the next time people that come from Europe into the United States, they're doing what's called a real identity check. So that's checks for real life ID through one of our portfolio companies, and this will check the visa waiver program for this 90-day period because they are specifically, you actually cannot capture this particular type of data and store it in the United States for legal reasons that exist in the European context. The larger point there, though, is that the battle cry here really is the right not to be observed. So it's not the right to be forgotten. That's just a silly
Well,
request from
where's
people.
policy being made on this right now? That's really what I'm interested in.
Oh,
What
so
political groups are not political, but what governmental groups,
yes,
standards groups
so
are currently engaged in this?
yeah, so if you saw like the Facebook settlement, where Facebook had to pay 550 million euros as a settlement to Illinois for violating their biometric laws, so other
Is there
states perked
is there
perked up to that.
is there an ISO standard that is there an ISO group that is currently ISO IC group currently focused on that
There are,
within the UN?
there are, and they are all utterly wrong. They don't understand what's actually being built and adopted already.
Yeah.
And so we look at this from first principles. So we started looking at the whole identity space 5 years ago. So I have a complete database and we have our own semantics within that space. The larger point there is you need to realize that certain things are being onboarded right now. So in certain companies out there that know that they need to take in this data, so health data on like the COVID thing and biometric data on like onboarding of identity and so forth, they started to realize that, hey, we don't want liability for that data, right? Because we cannot protect database. This is impossible from a technical level. Every CISO will tell you that. So they actively asked to have a solution to that problem. So right now, in the next couple of weeks, we're starting a pilot within Europe on this topic of good health pass, where this data will not be stored because they're just going to be reference cryptographic primitives that are always under owner control. Think about it in simplified fashions as like the enclave on your iPhone that stores your biometric data, right? Again, I'm simplifying it. It's more complex than that. So the technology is driving the implementation because it's simply needed. It's simply a requirement. And we will actively put companies out of business that still use database solutions to store PII. That should have never happened to begin with. That's why we have a digital landfill and not the World Wide Web. And that's why statistically, and I give a lot of talks about that, your identity will be stolen 3 times in the next 10 years, right? It will be abused. And obviously, it's not really a term. It's really someone taking the collection of your data that's available as copy out there for 5 cents in 4,000 databases and starting a new digital trail with that to create a credit card or something else and abuse it. And so, so if you want to learn more about that, I wrote an article like called "Taking the Red Pill," and it explains the basic principles of Web3 topology, with identity, quote unquote, being the most important layer. And again, I say quote unquote because it's the agency and attribution layer. It's the reversal of the current architecture of the web, which treats you as an oracle function rather than a human being, rather as an agent in the system.
What we should do, Christian, I think, is publish some of those articles and or links to them on our website. So if you just send them to me, I will
Yeah,
do that so that people
yeah.
can follow the
Yes,
discussion.
please.
Well,
Also on the
yeah.
Yeah.
website, Yeah,
An
on
important
the
disclaimer, yeah, it's important disclaimer here. Obviously, I'm speaking not on behalf of our fund in that context, so this is nothing. None of this is the usual blah 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 legal advice, financial advice, and so forth.
yeah.
This is all just simply shared with the spirit of peer review, right? I don't need likes. I don't need to be liked. For me, it's about knowing when I'm wrong and as soon as possible. My objective of sharing these ideas is to make better mistakes tomorrow, right? Because that's how I become a better investor and become a better human being all in general. Now, hopefully, help fix most of these problems that we're all suffering from, right?
Yeah, and this is why we even have these discussions, our virtual Infiom salons every other Wednesday on Zoom, and these discussions on the clubhouse every week at 1:30 to 2:30. We're running a little late today. We're going to end in a second. But if you want to sign up for the newsletter that Jeanette went through today, topic by topic, for our discussion, it's on www.infiom.com. And it says, if you want to read our news stories, click here, sign up for the newsletter. You will know what we will be discussing that Wednesday based on the newsletter that is mailed out on Sunday. And I know you read it, Christian, because you always send me comments about editing of the newsletter, so thank you for that.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a word Nazi, and every time I see Bitcoin misspelled in the wrong context, it's like I saw this earlier on the most prominent slide from one of the quote unquote VCs, prominent VCs in the space. They're still confusing Bitcoin and Bitcoin, as in Bitcoin uppercase B identifying the blockchain, lowercase b identifying the mining reward, and also still confusing Ethereum and Ether. It drives me
Yeah,
nuts to hear people say about Ethereum. I'm like, oh, it's gone? Oh my God. It's like, you bought the blockchain? What did you do with
yeah.
it? It's like,
That was a CNBC article too, so it was kind of funny, because
oh,
the AI pulls it out of the article's title.
yeah.
Anyway, so thank you for reading it, and thank you for always giving us great insight, everyone. Thank you, Jeanette, for going through the newsletter. So if you guys want to participate in that way, you're welcome to come up and ask questions, like everyone who raised their hand today. This is a 1-hour discussion. I want to thank our speakers and everyone
Recording
listening,
in progress.
Oh,
and
good Marcus.
hope to see you all in in our next clubhouse discussion next Wednesday, 1:30 to 2:30. Take care.
Thanks,
Follow us so you
Mariana.
can,
Thanks, everybody.
yes, you can know everything. Bye.